Hello. We are so glad you could make it. Thank you so much for coming down and making the time. Do you need coffee or tea or anything before we get started? Oh, I'm Nicole Zuckerman. I'm a senior software engineer here at Clover Health. I'm on the web applications team.
And I'm James. I'm also a senior software engineer on the web applications team. Thanks for coming in this morning. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, we want things to be like super comfortable for everyone involved. So if you can just start by on the whiteboard identifying whether there's a loop in a singly linked list, we'll wait.
No rush. Think out loud.
Yeah, how relevant is that to your daily life, right? So we're here to talk about how to make interviews better for employers, candidates, and like all of us.
So, how many of you have had a bad interview? How many of you know somebody who's had a bad interview? How many of you know or have used Homebrew? You wonder if the Homebrew guy has ever had a bad interview? Turned out he decided to talk about it in public. This is a recurring theme. This is Dan Liu. He's a guy you'll see linked a lot on Hacker News, talking about how one of the best people he ever knew got rejected by Google for not being technical enough. So, how many stories like these can we all tell?
And it's not just Google, they just happen to be big and people apply there and then can write about it and everything. And it's not even that these interviews are necessarily bad because you fail at them. I've had terrible interviews where I've actually succeeded at convincing this person that they wanted to hire me, but I had no idea why, because the things that we were doing had like no bearing on what I would do on a day-to-day basis. So why is it so awful? Everyone has nightmare stories, like you all do, we certainly do. They're too numerous to count. Why are they so common? Why do we have this like terrible way of figuring out who we want to work with? We think, we're like a reasonably intelligent group of people. You think we'd be able to figure this out, right? So one reason is that we tend to follow the leader. Everyone does what the big names do. Whatever pattern successful businesses have, we copy. And that sounds like a not terrible idea, right? But were these their practices at the time that they hired the people who made them successful? And can you afford the risks and trade-offs that they made? If Google's high false negative rate is pretty well known, they turn away people who are really great so that they don't let in anyone who is not super awesome. And that's okay for them because of the sheer quantity of applicants that they get, but chances are your company and our company doesn't have that same reach. Not to mention the fact that evidence actually doesn't support the idea that doing what they do will have the same result, because interviewing just isn't one size fits all.
There's also the problem of, well, what are you really targeting? People design these interview processes, which they say are testing for technical skill and qualifications and competence, but is that really what they're going after? A lot more often, it's something like this, where you end up with a feedback loop, where the way you've set up your interview influences who you hire, and who you hire influences the way you set up your interview, which influences who you hire, and it's both vicious and a circle. And then at some point you throw your hands up and say, well, why can't we hire the kinds of people we want to hire? Well, this may be one of the reasons why.
Yeah, and not only do you end up with this echo chamber like James was describing, you also end up shrinking the talent pool, not just for yourself, but for everyone else. People with imposter syndrome, which tends to skew disproportionately towards people from marginalized groups like people of color and women, are disproportionately affected by these bad interviews, regardless of how strong the candidates are. Women who have had a terrible interview are more likely to leave the industry altogether. So by perpetuating bad interview experiences, you make the pool more homogeneous for everyone.
And then there's the question of what exactly are you measuring when you set up your interviews? Supposedly, you're testing for skills you care about, but let's look at a few of these. How many of these skills do you use on a daily basis at your job? How many times do you have to spit out an algorithm on a whiteboard in your actual job? How many times do you have to implement a basic data structure? How many times does your boss come and stand over your shoulder and order you to do a coding challenge in the next 20 minutes or you're fired? These are interviewing skills, but they're not job skills. So why are we testing for these instead of for the actual job skills? What do the job skills look like? Well, they look like this.
Yeah, things that I regularly do include explaining trade-offs to a PM or working with another developer on some code that's already written, helping to explain how a system works, or like breaking a problem down into small pieces. I don't know about you, but I can't recall a single time I had to implement reverse from scratch in a job. Like, that's why I write Python.
So a good question to ask yourself when you're thinking about this stuff, and the way we focus so much on these technical trivia and algorithm challenges is just stop and think. In your typical day as a working programmer, what percentage of your time do you spend doing the things you're testing for in those technical sessions, actually sitting down and writing code, versus all the other things you do? Time you spend in meetings with PMs or other non-technical people, time you spend pairing with other programmers, doing code reviews, writing tests, designing something, breaking it down, all the other things that you do that aren't sitting in your IDE writing code, which take up an awful lot of your day-to-day time at your job, but you're not devoting quite as much of your interview process to it. So how do we fix it? Do we have some ideas?
Well, considering we still have like 20 minutes left in this talk, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we probably have some ideas.
Maybe. So, first thing you can do is start throwing out some assumptions. There are a lot of assumptions that underlie problems in technical interviews. People assume that they know what makes a good developer, that it's just something that everybody understands, that all the companies want the same thing. Here's some things that everybody assumes you want that are assumptions you can throw out. You don't need a degree in computer science to be a good programmer. You don't need to be able to regurgitate a bunch of algorithms onto a whiteboard to be a good computer programmer. You know what I do? I look things up. When I need to do something, I ask Google or I ask a reference book. You don't need to have open source contributions. You don't need to have a GitHub list of projects. You don't need to do competitive programming. You don't need to do any of those things. And in fact, there's some evidence that some of them are bad for you. Competitive programming, for example, has been a fad, but Peter Norvig of Google a couple of years ago gave a very interesting talk where he said Google had discovered that success at competitive programming correlates negatively with success on the job at Google. But we assume all these things are really good and positive when really those assumptions aren't all that well founded.
So, instead of assuming those things, and some of them might be true for the specific role that you're looking for, but aren't necessarily true across the board, so just question it. Let's try to have more realistic interviews where we assess the skills that you will actually use on the job on a day-to-day basis. Like using a real-world problem. Scope down to not give away trade secrets if that's a concern at your company, but surely there's something in your code base somewhere that you can use. Use a real computer. Writing on a whiteboard is like a step away from normal developing that introduces such unnecessary cognitive and physical overhead, especially if, like me, you're paranoid about how terrible your whiteboard handwriting is. And like James mentioned, the internet is like such a useful tool for helping me solve problems all the time. And
how many people look something up in Google every day at work?
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm applying to work at a company that you work at, don't you care about my ability to like find the information that I need? And it's also really great to work together with people so that both of you will see what it's like. When was the last time you all had to solve something from no code at all in like 30 minutes? Yeah, like it happens occasionally, but it's like really not the norm. And so for us to have that in our interview process really skews the results that we're going to get. So just a couple more minutes on the importance of collaboration, because I think that this is a skill that we like highly undervalue. It takes more work for the interviewer, but it gives such better signal to both you and the person who's applying to work with you. And it's also more rewarding for candidates for the most part, and is more representative of the day-to-day work that you end up doing. And you should look at them like people you want to work with, because that's why you are talking to them in the first place. You have an opening and you want to fill it. So really, you want all candidates to succeed. You should go into the room thinking, I hope this is my next coworker. Because otherwise, why are you bothering? So let's treat them accordingly as someone that you want to work with. So here are some ideas that we came up with, both from the company that we work with, some of them we use regularly, and just some brainstorming with ourselves and other people. But surely you can come up with others. This is just a jumping off point. Do a real code review. It doesn't have to be their code. You can have them look at your code or someone's code at the company and walk through what's actually happening. Bring a bug and work through that actual process together. Give them a spec and see how they would break it down. And
We do that. That's a lot of our work.
yeah, breaking things down into like a little chunk at a time. I really like this last one. Give them notes from a problem and ask them to write a postmortem on it, because you can tell so much about the questions that someone asks about a problem that you had. So this one is also super important. Non-technical sessions are really just as important as the technical ones. They should have veto power. If someone treats a designer or an operations person poorly, that should be a huge red flag for you. Engineers have to work with not just each other, but a lot of people at the company. And if you consistently have bad experiences crossing that technical, non-technical line, you're going to set up some really bad precedent in your company.
So we've been talking about some serious things, so here's a fun slide to take a break. This, by the way, is from a great talk by James Mickens, who works at Microsoft. The talk itself was about security, but he makes a great point that so many company websites have all of these smiling people who you don't actually see when you go look at the company, which is an important point because your interview panels need to be diverse. They need to include women. They need to include people of color, because those interview panels will turn up things you wouldn't find out otherwise. I have personally sat in interviews with a candidate where the other person running the interview with me was a woman, and she would ask a question and the candidate would answer me. That's a fail. If you don't acknowledge or talk to someone because they're not the stereotype of what a programmer is supposed to look like, that's an automatic fail, but you don't find out that they do that unless you're running your panels this way. I know you've had this happen to you in panels.
Yeah, this exact same situation has happened to me. In an entirely separate interview with a totally separate candidate, it's a lot less rare than you would hope, and you would never know unless you had a woman on that panel. But you can learn different things about someone with people of color on your panel, with queer folk on your panel. Women aren't the only canaries in the coal mine, and I think we over-index on that a bit. And there are actually the unrelated benefits that having people of color, queer folk, women on your panels will make the candidates see that your colleague pool is diverse, and then people of color, queer people, and women who are interviewing with your company will feel a little more at home there, which personally I think is like A+, one of the big goals. So all this is well and good, but the best ideas in the world won't help unless you sit down with your team and make your expectations, your values, and your goals explicit. Zen of Python, guidepost of my life as well as my code.
Thank you, Tim Peters. So, the Zen of Python tells us be explicit. What this means in an interviewing context is we need to write down what we're going to care about. We need to make a list. We've already thrown out all these assumptions about, well, they have to have a GitHub page and they have to have open source contributions and they have to know algorithms. We've already thrown all that stuff out, so we're not going to test on that. We should figure out what we are going to test on. And it doesn't have to be one size fits all. There is no one size fits all for interviewing. You need to figure out with your colleagues and your coworkers and your management team, what do we care about on our team, and write it down. There are some dangerous things you can get into, such as some of these vague words like professionalism. Let's talk about that for a second. Professionalism. Is a hairstyle professional? Is my tone of voice professional? Is my lack of an accent professional? If you knew what my natural-born accent sounded like, you might be surprised. I was born and raised in West Virginia. I had my accent drilled out of me by a speech therapist because I used to talk like this. Would this make a difference if I came in and interview talk like that? Do these things have any bearing on my ability to do a job? No. But this is what gets wrapped up in professionalism.
Yeah. Confidence is another one that's really tricky. It's not actually a great indicator of skill, and in fact, it could potentially be a sign of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And when you look for confidence, you'll miss anyone with imposter syndrome, like pretty much guaranteed. Confidence means nothing more than a person thinks they know what they're doing, regardless of whether that's actually true in reality or not. So maybe leave that one aside. Asking questions or having an interrogative tone of voice are not necessarily indicative of a lack of confidence anyway. They could be signs of wanting a deeper understanding of a problem scope or of being raised in a culture where your demographic group is dinged for being assertive. So neither of things should disqualify someone from seeming competent. Another one to be wary of is potential. Be careful who you extend the benefit of the doubt to. It likely goes to people who fit the stereotypes of a role, for example, young white men, because of the human brain's pattern matching capability, and this is exactly how bias creeps in.
So, how can we design a good interview process?
I have no idea.
I don't know either. Anybody got any ideas?
Okay, fine, maybe we have a couple of ideas. So step one, what qualities do I value most in those I work with? Consider what makes a good colleague. Make sure you assess non-technical skills in engineers. Someone who can't communicate with anyone might be great in a vacuum, but actually might not be a great role for a fit at your company.
So once you've thought about what you actually value in someone, ask yourself, how do I actually evaluate a stranger on that? And that's a hard question, so stop and think, how did I recognize these qualities in people I've already worked with? Who are the good people that I've worked with, and what did I recognize in them? Was it, oh, well, that person sat down and did a wonderful code review with me, or came really prepared and well-researched to a meeting on how we were going to design something. Think about those signs that you use to notice people you already work with who are really good, and then start looking for those signs in people you're interviewing.
This may be the only time in my life when I ever recommend playing devil's advocate, because normally it doesn't need one, but let's say you decide that quality X is a skill you want to evaluate for, and method Y is how you'll do it. Spend some time coming up with your best argument against your own idea and see if you can poke holes in your own logic and find your implicit assumptions or your false correlations between quality and method of assessing it. And if you're still convinced that method Y is a good choice after all that, go ahead, you have my blessing.
So another thing to do is to be blind, or at least as blind as possible. You can't always, treat someone as just an amorphous blob that you don't know anything about. But applying some blind interviewing techniques to the way you're recruiting and hiring can actually make a really big difference in how you approach people and how you interact with them. So this is a wonderful paper that looked at a bunch of GitHub pull requests and found, based on gender, found that pull requests from women are more likely to be accepted than pull requests from men, but only when people don't know they were from women. Knowing someone's gender or race or ethnicity or all sorts of things about them preloads all sorts of biases into your brain that you may not even be aware you have. Preventing those biases from loading up in the first place can be a big, big help to you.
And honestly, we're not the first industry to have a bias problem, and unfortunately, I doubt we'll be the last. Classical music went through this like decades ago. They didn't hire many women and said women like just weren't as skilled or like weren't interested in putting in the
Does
work.
that sound familiar?
So until they remove the interviewer's ability to know the auditioner's gender before making a decision to hire or not, once they put the auditioner behind a curtain while they played and dampened footfall sounds so that you couldn't hear high heels, suddenly the percentage of women hired rose dramatically. So did women suddenly get better at music? Or did orchestras just finally have the chance to make an unbiased decision?
So there are some ways you can do this in tech. One of the first things you can do is the resume. Before the resume gets to the desk of someone who's going to make a decision based on it, you can scrub some things out of that. You can scrub names out of it. You can scrub schools and educational background out of it. You can scrub some extracurricular activities out of it, because those things are all clues to someone's gender, their race, their background. And there's a lot of research, just like with the pull request thing, showing that if you have a name that sounds stereotypically white, for example, you'll get a lot more callbacks on interviews from your resume than if you have a stereotypically Hispanic or African American name on your resume. Same thing for colleges. You can anonymize a code sample before you hand it off to someone to review. You don't have to put their name on it. You can just say, here's the code sample for the candidate we're looking at later. Could you please take a look at it? Now, of course, this isn't foolproof, and there are still ways that this stuff can sneak in. So, for example, letters of recommendation. This is from another article about orchestral review, but points out something important. Letters of recommendation often use gendered language even if you don't realize it. The case here was women being described as caring and men being described as having strong relationships because we're strong and manly, and that's what we do. So you can't always eliminate all of this or eliminate every way for it to creep in, but you can at least take some steps and try to shield yourself from your own biases.
And we're problem solvers, right? Like that's what we do. So challenge accepted. So you definitely want to be consistent in your interview process, because if you ask a different question of each candidate, you'll have no good way of ensuring that you're measuring their performance apples to apples. But we're all humans and have different needs and lives, and accommodating those is valuable and kind and smart. So figuring out the same thing from everyone, or requiring the same thing from everyone, might exclude candidates for no good reason, even if there are other ways to assess that same skill. So for example, parents of small children may not have free time to do a 4-hour coding homework at night, or someone with a full-time job may not be able to do a 3-day on-site. People with different needs can be great coworkers, but not if your interviewing rigidity excludes them from the candidate pool. Not to mention the fact that candidates are also evaluating you and your company and may not be sold enough on you yet to be willing to invest like 8 hours of time into your homework.
So, and finally, the most important thing we want to hit on. Someone you're interviewing is a coworker you haven't worked with yet, even if you don't end up hiring them. And they're human.
They are?
They're human.
Shoot.
They're not aliens. They're not monsters. They're not trying to sneak into your company. They're not trying to tunnel under the walls and get in there. You are not the last defender of your company's safety and honor. They're just humans, just like you. How do we treat humans?
Hopefully well, I would like to
Hopefully
say.
well.
And honestly, if they're not a good fit yet, maybe they will be in a year. Or maybe they know someone who is a good fit. You want everyone to leave feeling good, saying nice things about you, regardless of whether they were offered a job. Not to mention, you should just treat everyone well anyway. It builds character.
And I believe the author of this one is in the room. There's also the downside of having a bad interview process, which is people come away feeling like this. That's a fail. That's a fail for your company. That's a fail for who set up your interviewing, if people are coming away from your interviews feeling that way. So, that's what we think. She's Nicole. I'm James. Those are minions.
Actually, that's me up there. Do we have
We have some
a
time
few
for
minutes
questions. Yeah.
So I really like to talk about code review. I've just started doing the practice, even in text on the phone. Emailing some code and just having them walk through it. I found that it gets at a lot of depth, ability to kind of empathize with the person who wrote the code, try to understand what problem they're trying to solve in a way that actually writing code doesn't necessarily do. So if you have anything to add about code review and why you choose that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think code reviewing is like a super valuable skill, both because you can see how someone looks at someone else's code and also see their thought process about how they like just dig into a problem in the first place. Another thing that code review can suss out is the kind of people who look at some code sample and say, oh, this person was an idiot. Why did they do it that way? I'm just going to refactor everything. Because those people take a lot of time that might otherwise be used to solve other problems in your day-to-day life. And so if you can figure that out early, that's really valuable. There's like a lot of benefits to code review.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a music major. I really love what you had to say about education and all that. I wonder if you could explore a bit about what you said about culture fit. You know, in my experience, one mean person can absolutely ruin an organization. So how would you go about judging culture fit?
So, how do we judge culture fit? Well, we don't try to do just a single dedicated culture fit session. That's not, like, it's not a thing that you can just set aside some time to check whether this person is a jerk. Like, that's something that people need to be watching for in all of your interview panels from the first moment you pick up the phone and call them. It's a thing that is a constant part of the process. That's why we mentioned, for example, the candidates who don't talk to women in the panel, who only talk to the man in the panel. That's a culture fit test even when it's a technical session. And that's something that they're going to fail the culture fit on. But that is something that you need to be watching out for all the way through. And there aren't a whole lot of like automatic fail flags. There are some, obviously.
That was one of them.
That was one of them. But it's a thing that you can really get a feel for because you're going to have a bunch of your employees talking to this person. I mean, even if you do, you know, a slightly better version of a typical interview, you're doing, what, 5-6 hours often in a single day? You're going to get a lot of time with this person. Trying to concentrate it into just one, like, half hour, let's sit down and have lunch is going to fail. Aggregating across all the experiences of a bunch of different people talking to this person is going to be much more successful.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that we do at Clover Health is all the interviews are panels. They're at least 2 people. So the more people you can get in front of a candidate, the more signal you can get, technical and non-technical. And I also can't emphasize enough the importance of having like PMs and designers in those sessions to work with them and see what that would be like. We're also at Clover Health very explicit about what things we're looking for, what things we value in our culture and want to make sure that we perpetuate. And everyone is instructed that those are as important as technical skills to assess in all of the interviews that we do.
We have documents.
We have a lot of
There's
them.
all written down. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on not wanting to kind of have like an intimidating silence while someone's working on a problem, right? Kind of collaborate with them to some degree. Of course, you wouldn't want to collaborate with them to the degree that you're helping them so much that you can't actually assess their skill. Can you talk a little more about how you strike the right balance between those two extremes?
I like, one of them is I like the way, I called this the Nicole method the first time I saw her do it, and she's going to hide behind her sweater now. Where it was, we were doing a session where it basically runs as presenting a problem to the candidate, but the approach is, let's say the candidate is going to be the technical lead of this project. Here's a rough spec for it, and what we want is for them to work with us to describe, okay, how are they going to break this down? How are they going to figure out what needs to be built to solve this? How are they going to assign the work out to people as the technical lead? what follow-up questions are they going to have, what further requirements do they want to gather, and treating that as just a fully interactive session where we're participating, because we do that. Every time we kick off a project, we have a technical lead who's breaking things down and sitting there with us, and we're having conversations about, well, should we do this, or should we approach it this way, and do you want to work on that part, or should I? Like, you can get that flow going very easily if you set the session up to do it.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things to do in those kinds of sessions is ask clarifying questions of them. So like, when you're making this API call, when does that happen? Or like, what do you think we should do about this part right over here, or something like that? And so it still is collaborative. I'm not giving answers or anything. I'm like drawing their attention to certain things, but it's still a conversation, and I still get a lot of signal. It's definitely a skill that I've had to acquire, though. It's like non-trivial. Was that useful? Okay. Any other questions, or have we like blown your minds?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm one of two back-end female developers in my company, and if we want to have diverse experience analysts, it means I get pulled into it, and I get to do recurring work as well. How do you balance that?
Yeah. So at Clover Health, the expectation is that the time that you spend interviewing is part of your job, and if that means that you are in order to do the job that you want to do of the interviewing, if that means that people have to understand that your capacity is like 70% of normal for a bit, then that needs to be explicitly said to like your team lead or whatever. And I also think that like you should have some say in that. 'Cause if you're like, I've been doing 2 interviews a day for a month, I feel like I'm a recruiter, I want to get back to coding, that at some point that has to be okay. Your company can't entirely lean on you to do all the work for them, but when they do ask you to step up in this way, they really need to recognize it. So I think that that's like, it's a hard position to be in, but hopefully through like recognition of the work that it takes and understanding of like your needs as a developer to just like do this thing sometimes, hopefully you can come to like some arrangement that works for you.
I was kind of wondering, I guess one of the weirdest things about the interview process is you never, ever, 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 ever get feedback. So to face that question, do you think as candidates that we're inherently fragile and we'll just have a nervous breakdown if we get feedback, we're going through a rage because the company, physically against the company, or are we like human beings who actually want feedback and it can be constructive both ways? We should constructive, give feedback.
You don't have an opinion on this at all, do you? Do you want to repeat it?
So the question is, when giving feedback, do we see the candidate as fragile and needing to be protected from it, or a human being who wants feedback and should get it? The answer is, I believe we had a slide saying people we're interviewing are humans just like us. But giving feedback can be tricky. Giving feedback constructively is a skill, and giving feedback in an interview environment is even more complex because your HR department is probably going to have something to say about what you can and can't tell people. So that's going to be a little more complex to set up.
Yeah.
But definitely what feedback you can give, you should give.
Yeah, I would also argue that we have to be particularly careful about giving people interview feedback, because looking for a job and like asking for something puts people in a very vulnerable position, and you as an interviewer are in a position of like power and authority. And it definitely takes tact and care to give people feedback when there is this power inequality, but I definitely think that we should put in the time to do that. We shouldn't like say, oh, it's too hard, we can't. We just like need to be aware of what we're doing.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of, like, if you're doing a technical session, or even when you're just doing code review at work, we'll teach things like talk about the code, not the person. And the code is not a reflection of the person. And a problem in the code is not a reflection of a problem with the person. Being careful about giving good constructive feedback that is feedback on what happened rather than feedback on you as a person, because you're just terrible, obviously.
Yeah, so hopefully that helps us level up too
Yeah.
in our own work.
So, if you were in charge of the university course, teaching
If we could run a course to teach things that CS doesn't teach that engineers need to know.
Humanities.
Yeah. I'm with her. I have a philosophy degree.
And my master's is in English literature and women's studies. So, but some things that I highly value are things like empathy. I think everyone needs that. The ability to give other people feedback in a way that is not like personally hurtful. Managing time, making estimates, breaking a problem down. I feel like these are all things that take a long time to learn. And I feel like almost everyone learns it on the job because I don't know a lot of people that actually got that in college.
Do you have any advice for someone who's interviewing and they're in, they're applying for a Python job and they're like, we don't have linked lists, and they're getting a linked list question. Can you steer the interview to be, more like you guys? As need to do.
Can you steer the interview if they're doing some unfortunate things? You can try. I've tried a couple of times. I've hung up on several companies or walked out. It's difficult, and it really is a case-by-case thing. A lot of it is going to depend on how receptive the specific interviewer is that you're talking to that day. Some of them may be okay with you pushing on to a different topic. Some of them may be okay with you trying to get the canned question out of the way so you can have an actual interview, which is a thing that I've tried to do a couple of times and sometimes succeed, sometimes failed.
Yeah, I would say here's another case where being explicit is really helpful. Saying like, I know that you probably have the standardized interview question, and we can totally do that, but after that, I would love to get to some like collaborative problem solving because that's how I evaluate what companies I want to work at. Saying like those kinds of things, like may help, and it may not. And I've totally been in an interview before where it was one of those like, you just had to know what the algorithm was, and someone was not super receptive to doing it any other way. And I just BS'd my way through the question, and they were like, I don't know, I like fooled them into thinking that this was like actually going well, and I was happy, and then I left and never came back.
Yeah. And yeah, unreceptive interviewers can be a problem. I know someone who had a very similar session to that where the problem had two textbook algorithms. My friend came up with one of them. The interviewer only knew the other and flunked her because he assumed that, well, that's not the algorithm I memorized, so it must be wrong. So it really is a mixed bag as to what kind of interviewer you get.
But also maybe if they're really resistant to that sort of thing,
That's a sign.
yeah, that might be an indicator for you that that's not the best place. And I know that not everyone has like a ton of great choices out there, and so you might say like, well, I have to work with what I've got, in which case the best thing you can do is just say like, here's what I'm looking for, and hope for the best.
And then if you get the job, work to change things from within.
Yeah. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, okay.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.